form and document actions. We're actually going to begin, before getting into the specifics, what is an action itself? So what's the use case? What does it actually do? Then we'll move into the specifics of the webinar, which are the document level actions. That's going to be, why would you want to use a document level action? How are they accessed? What are the use cases? And we're going to have a demo, and then we're going to have a brief explanation as to how that demo was set up to kind of give you some ideas and some groundwork for you to take this and run with it, if you will. The form level actions is going to take a similar agenda. So where to find form level actions in your BarTender designer, what do form level actions do, some use cases, and as I mentioned, the same thing, we're going to cover a demo, and that one is a little bit more complex, and then how that demo was configured. So as mentioned, we'll start with the actions themselves, just so that we're on the same page, or we at least have an understanding before we start dropping a lot of this terminology once we get into the document and the form level actions. So an action in itself is a task or function that's executed based on an event. So based on where you create this action, it's going to be something like upon a new record, upon a copy at the end of a print job, when a web service request is received, when a file is dropped, etc. There's really a lot of use cases for the actions, and any given specific action more or less does the same thing. It's just triggered by a different event or a different thing happening. In today's section, which is all going to be in the BarTender designer, we have 6 categories available to us with around 60 actions more or less. So we have a lot of options available to us, and obviously there's not going to be a way to cover all 60 actions in the hour that we have allocated today. So we're going to try to cover some examples, some good use cases that we came up with. And really, I'm going to be repeating this a lot throughout the webinar. You'll notice that this is really a very flexible tool, and it's going to depend on what's going on in your environment, your requirements, and really your imagination. You don't have to have any programming background or anything like that, but it's going to be what you can come up with and how you can leverage the actions to satisfy whatever scenario you have going on. So now we know kind of what they do, roughly, how many we have, and they're semi-universal as well. So you'll see actions throughout the BarTender suite itself. While we're not going to be covering anything outside the BarTender designer today, they do exist, as I'm sure most of you are familiar, in some level in BarTender designer, in process builder, and in the integration platform. So those are going to be the different locations where you'll be able to access them, and you'll see different options available to you, and you'll see a little variance of actions available to you as well, but they more or less, as I mentioned, do the same thing. Some examples of some actions are going to be, these are not in any specific order of importance or anything like that, and as I mentioned, it's a long list, but these are just some good examples on common ones that you'll probably see yourself using and that we'll use later in our demos as well. So the print action is going to be as pretty self-explanatory. So anything that is something like run a BTXML script, print a BarTender document, that sort of thing. You also have database actions. So that's going to be anything as far as reading data from a database, updating a database, anything that's related to a database. And we do have a list of supported databases available to us. Once we get to that section, I'll bring up how to double check what platforms we support and what options you have available to you. We also have file actions. So if you want to read a file, move a file, rename a file, upon a given event, it'll be executed. We have web service actions as well. So we can have an integration receive a web service request, as I'm sure some of you are familiar. Also, what we can do, even from the BarTender designer level, is based on an event and based on data and everything that we can gather on what's going on, whether that's database information or user input, whatever it may be. We can also send out a web service request to another system if it requires, and that can be conditionally based and all that. All these actions can be based on certain events, certain conditions. So that's a little overview on the actions at a really high level. We're going to cover how to get to each one of these areas, but when you actually go to open an action, or create one, I should say, you're going to be displayed an actions properties dialog or page. So in each action is going to have its own properties, and these are going to vary. So what I mean by this is the tabs on the right hand screenshot that you can see, the red box that you see there is going to be what varies. Now all actions are going to have the action tab, but the other tabs are going to vary depending on what kind of action it is and what it does. So an example of that. In the screenshot that we see here, this is a print document action. So we see all properties related to the action of printing a document. So that's going to be what document we want to print, what printer we want to print to, copies, are we referencing a data source, are we satisfying or providing a value for a query prompt, that sort of scenario. If this was an update database action, we would see a dialog, and we're going to actually see that in the demo today. We would actually see a dialog for the properties of that connection. So what database are we connected to, the table that we're the table or view or whatever you may have set up that we're specifically pulling data from, or updating the field related to that table, and everything that goes along with that. So you're going to see different options, but more or less they kind of do the same thing as far as you're configuring the properties for the selected action. So I mentioned the action tab as well. So this is going to be a tab that you're really going to see everywhere throughout the BarTender suite where actions exist. So anytime you create an action, you're going to have this action tab. And it's important because, well, it lets you give your action a name and description. So that lets you identify it. That's useful if you have, let's say, 5 different print actions and you don't know which one is which, or you want to give each one a specific name related to the label or template that you have selected. It'll keep you organized, right? I think that's important, but I think even more importantly also is going to be the run action section. So this is going to be where you set under what circumstances this action is run. So I mentioned previously that we could potentially have 5 different print actions here to keep it simple. We don't always have to print or run all 5 print actions every single time that event occurs. We can kind of get a little bit more finite than that. So what we can do is we can say this is going to be based on data coming in from the database. If vendor equals XYZ, we want this document to print. If it doesn't, we want the other document to print. And then based on that, based on information coming in from your database, based on something that maybe that a user types in at print time, or based on a series or a combination of those things, you can build your own statement, and then based on that will determine when this action is executed or when it's run. And we really can't talk about the actions, the properties, and setting everything up without touching a little bit on variables. As I mentioned, we're kind of just getting started here on the foundation, just getting a little level understanding, and then we'll move into the specifics. So a variable. So what is it? I'm sure most of us can imagine what it probably means. But to be specific to the BarTender world, or how we use them, a variable is something that you can assign a value to, and that value can be dynamic. So an example of that, right, to simplify it, if we're connected to a database and every time we see a company name that needs to be updated, whether it be because we're using it here as an action, whether we're using it as part of our sending data back to a database, whatever it may be, we want to pull that company name in, and we want to make sure that it's dynamic and it's relevant to the current record, let's say. So based on that, we can assign that field to a single named data source. That named data source will be available to us here. And then whenever we see the percent, the example that you see on screen there, so percent, printer name percent, or on the right in the screenshot, circled in blue, those are all examples of variables that I created, is going to be how you can identify where an action exists. So what's going to end up happening here in this scenario, circled in blue, is that this job name is not going to be called percent username percent. This job name, and etc., and the rest of it, this job name is going to be called the username value that's assigned to that variable, the current time that's assigned to that variable. I believe that's actually the actual live current time, and the serial number associated to that variable. So that's going to be dynamic for us. So for the job name, it's going to let us identify the job. and we'll assume that that serial number is going to be unique to some degree. So then we have a history of all our print jobs, and we can uniquely identify a job name. And the same logic applies to really everywhere that you see a dialog. Essentially, you're able to insert a variable. So we can have in this scenario here, we have a dynamic printer, the copies are dynamic, and the job name is dynamic. If we don't, for this specific type of action here, and it may vary, but for this specific type of action, which is a print document action, if we don't select anything, it's just going to default to however the label is saved. So if let's say we uncheck the printer, that means that it'll by default go to whatever printer is associated with that particular BarTender document that we decided to print. Also, to repeat that phrase once again, variables are semi-universal as well. So some of what you learned today is going to be transferable to the other companion applications that I mentioned earlier. So it's good to just have that foundation work set up so that we understand it and we can use the software to its full extent. So we know that the variables can be dynamic. They're assigned values. Where do they come from, right? That's probably what some of you are asking. You might have more locations based on where you open the actions from or how you have things set up, but the main categories are going to be the event, the global, and the system. Now, the global and the system are extremely important. They have their use cases, and I think, yes, we even use them in the demo today. But you're going to be spending most of your time in the event. At least when I'm designing my projects, I'm working on things. That's where I find myself sourcing most of my variables from. So for the event section, as you can see on screen, so any named data source, it does have to be named. So that's kind of like the caveat or the thing to be aware of. For any named data source, whatever name we give it, it'll show up as such under our event category. Any database field, so let's say we have a form or a document that is connected to a database and we're pulling in information to populate our label or to populate our form or to pass data elsewhere, etc. Those database fields are going to be available to us here as well. What I usually do is I create named data sources, and those named data sources are then either leave it as embedded data or assign it to a database field. If it needs to be the clock or anything else, any kind of data source type that you would use on a given label that you need that information in your actions categories here, I would give a name just to keep things organized. We then move into global. So we have like dates and times. So that's going to be, your current date, current time, or at least as we see it on the particular PC that's running these actions. We use the date and times in our demo today. That's the one global, or the couple, global actions that we use. And there's other environmental details such as, folder and file names, usernames and groups, and those relate to Windows users and groups. And if that information is needed, either for logging purposes, let's say we're writing back to a database or updating a database and we want to know who printed what and when, even though we have our own logging features, perhaps you need it in a proprietary database or your own database. That's where that would come in and you would be able to capture that information and do whatever you need to do with it. Lastly is the systems one. So that's going to be anything like as far as what Windows version you're on, the build, if this computer is attached to the domain, any domain information, and such things. If you're ever not sure, of course, you can open the insert variable dialog, which you see on the right, and we'll discuss how to get there. There's a few different ways. Open that dialog on the right, and you can click through there and you can see all the options. I actually did not count that one for this webinar, but there are several global and systems actions. I mean, in total, we're probably looking at about the same amount of actions as we do variables here available to us. So we have a little bit of foundation now. Hopefully that if you've never worked with actions in BarTender specifically, that gives you a little understanding as to just what they do, how they work, where they exist. And then we're now going to try to apply some background information and then a use case to each one of the sections that we're talking about today. And we're going to start with document level actions. So a document level action is accessed at the document level. So as we see on screen here, there's some instructions. So if you click on File, BarTender Document Options, your Actions tab, make sure you enable that checkbox if you want them to be live, and the Document Actions icon, that's going to open up that dialog, our Actions dialog that we talked about. You would use a document level action specifically though, instead of the other companion applications or instead of a form level action, when you want an action to be executed at certain stages of your print process. Now we'll see what I'm talking about here in the next slide because we'll see this, we call them events. But let's say that upon print job start, these are just some examples, we have a couple more. So let's just say on print job start, after each record, after each copy, at the end of a print job, etc. So at any one of those given events, at all these events, whatever it may be, we want something to happen, we can do so. And remember, we only have a few print document actions here. I want to say we have maybe 4 or 5 that actually print a document. So that means that there's a lot that you can do that's not necessarily printing. It may be updating a database, sending a web service request, parsing data, pulling data from a file, whatever it may be. So there's going to be a lot of different options. So regardless of the demos that we provide today, I urge you, if you're interested in this, you're obviously here, right? I urge you to open up BarTender 2019, go into here, and then just scroll through and look through the available actions. It's not going to be, perhaps you don't have a use case for it immediately, and this is the way that I usually function, but just knowing that it's there, you can later recall that and say, hey, I remember there's something like that that exists. I might be able to use that in this scenario. So just knowing about this tool or these tools is really half the battle. So we go into File, going back to the, getting back on topic here. So we go to File, BarTender Document Options on the Actions tab, and we open up that dialog. And here's a screenshot of what that's going to look like. So it's going to be similar. I want to say similar throughout companion applications and all that, what this dialog looks like. The main difference that you're going to notice is going to be the events panel on the left. So these events are going to change based on where you open this dialog from. Then, based upon that, to go even further, is going to depend on under which event, and the event is going to be the action groups that you see there, under which event you place it. So if I place a print action under print job canceled, every time a print job is canceled, that print action will be executed. I could also say, if a print job is canceled, I want my manager to receive an email because print jobs should not be being canceled for, whatever reason. So you can do all sorts of things like that, and you can include information such as who canceled the print job, or at least who's running the application, right? Who canceled the print job, what data was going to be on that label, and all things like that. As long as the data is available to us at that stage of the printing process, generally speaking, we can use it and you can customize it and incorporate that into your actions. And once again, we incorporate that data into our actions by using variables. Now, I will say that what I have highlighted here on update database records, I keep mentioning variables, generally speaking, because that's usually, in my experience, how it's used. You want these things to be dynamic. That's kind of part of what gives this a lot of power and flexibility. But you can also have things like static. So this is actually part of the demo that's coming up, and it'll make a little bit more sense as we go through it. But the highlighted field in the middle of your screen where it says record value and condition, checked in question mark, and it's set to yes. So that's a static value. Whenever this is run, it's going to update that particular field on this table in this database to yes, where the condition equals attendee number equals that variable attendee number. So we have a mix of static and dynamic data going on here, which at face value can get a little complicated, but once you kind of wrap your head around that whole concept, you'll be able to use that, like I said, pretty much anywhere. And it's going to be like anything else that you develop. Think about it as developing a little mini integration or a little mini custom application where you're going to have to go through, and there's going to be some trial and error, especially when you're first beginning. And as you kind of dial it in, it'll automate the process and it'll do a lot of the work for you. Continuing on, we're just going to do a quick tour here of the UI while we have this screenshot up. So across the top, we have the ribbon. So that's going to be where you have your copy, your paste, your cut, so your basic clipboard functionalities. You can also use your keyboard shortcuts, and you can copy and paste actions themselves anywhere, copy and paste them into the event. You can click, drag, and drop them into whatever event it should be. You can also copy and paste data from the property side. So whether it be a variable or static data, whatever it may be, just your basic clipboard functionality. The actions is going to display everything action related. So under actions, you'll see a drop down with all the actions that you have on this particular page or this particular form. And then the action groups is going to show you your groups. You can also do a search and replace. So let's say that we use a given variable. So let's say the attendee number, since we have that on screen. Let's say we have the attendee variable available to us in 20 different locations, because this is a pretty simple example that we see on screen here, but they get very complex. So let's say we have it in 20 different locations. Instead of in this page here, throughout the different events, different actions. So instead of clicking through, hoping that we don't miss anything and just wasting some time going through and updating everything, we can do a find and we can go through and update each one individually, or we can do a replace. So as I'm sure most of us are familiar, basic functionality with most editors and Office products out there. And then we get to still under the editing. So we get into insert variable and insert symbol. So these are grayed out here, and I actually should have selected that so they would be highlighted, but hopefully you can still see that on screen. It's towards your top middle left there. So insert variable, it's the little blue X, and you'll see that symbol throughout the companion applications as I mentioned. So anytime you click on a dialog, so let's say I clicked where it says yes, which is highlighted right now, that icon will light up for us, and if we click on the insert variable icon, we'll see that event, global, and system category, and we'll be able to just double click any one of the variables and insert it into this dialog. So that's one way to do it. It's a little bit tedious because you have to open the dialog, you have to search for it and make sure you might have a big record set or something like that you have to scroll through. So you can manually add variables as well. Just type in percent attendee number %, and that will let you still leverage the variable. The only thing to be careful about that is, of course, typos happens, and if a typo does happen, this is sensitive to that. It's not going to, it wants the very verbose variable name, if you will, no variants of it. So if you don't use the actual variable name, you're not going to get the behavior that you would expect. That's a little information on the document level actions. So continuing on to our next section here, we're going to have a document level actions demo. So we'll pull up a recording and we'll go through a demo. So keep in mind that this is going to be the first part of the demo is going to be the end result, the product. I don't believe we'll go into any details, but we have a follow-up in the next slide that goes into a little bit of the options and the properties, and I'm going to be stopping throughout to explain what's going on and why it was done this way. I'm going to repeat it again. This is just one way to do this or to go about this. You could do the same thing that I've done in my demo several different ways, and whenever you come across a scenario, it's going to be the same thing. You'll just want to determine what's the most future-proof, what's the most flexible, and then go with that option, or at least that's what I usually do. So if you have other ideas or other ways that this could be done, you're absolutely right. It can be done in other ways. So this is just what we did for today's demo here. So in my little scenario, some background, we have a big BarTender 2019 event coming up. This is going to be hosted at an event center. I'm sure most of us have been to an event of some sort, a conference of some sort, right? We go to a desk somewhere, we check in, we get a badge. Depending on our status, if we're either part of the staff, if we're just a regular attendee, if we're an organizer, if we're a VIP, we've seen that before and that's relevant in today's demo. We're either going to maybe get some different swag, if you call it. You might get a keychain, you might get a lanyard, and the VIP members, you sometimes even get electronics or something better, right? So the scenario is this. We're going up to the check-in desk. We have a print operator here running this badge template here, and it's actually connected to a database. We want to be able to select the attendee that is checking in. We want to make sure and we want to see the status of that attendee, and if they haven't checked in before, we want to go ahead and print out their badge and give them whatever information or documentation, etc., whatever they're going to receive that's related to their status, attendee status. And if they are VIP, we want to give them a voucher because they're going to get some special BarTender electronic or something like that, some bartender related thing, maybe a free license or something, let's say. So we want to make sure that those VIPs are flagged. That voucher though is going to print on a different printer than this card printer that we're using here. And for today's example, I'm not going to be physically printing, and the reason for that is I want to actually show you on screen what the printouts look like. So I configured everything to print to PDF so that we can review, but in a real world scenario, what would be happening here is we would be using a card printer of some model, and then for the voucher, we would be using a color printer, maybe even just a simple laser printer or something to that degree. So we also want to give a notification of some sort, a heads up to the print operator, the person checking all these people in. We want to let them know that, hey, this person is a VIP. You want to look over to your right and grab that voucher and deliver it to them. Maybe give them some instructions as well verbally on what to do with it. So that's kind of the background. Let's go ahead and see how we went about resolving or setting up that scenario. So here we begin with the event badge itself. We have a form. This is going to be where we select what guest. We have a confirmation of what the badge looks like. So before we print a badge, before we mark that attendee as checked in, we want to make sure we didn't, accidentally click on the wrong person. So we'll get a confirmation so the print operator can confirm, yes, that's correct, that's the person, and that's their company name. And form 3 is actually going to be the conditional print. So this will only appear when a VIP guest is detected, and that's going to be based off the data coming in from the database. So this is going to be the alert that a print operator receives when they encounter a VIP member. And when they hit print, what's going to happen is for only VIP guests, they'll actually get a printout, a personalized or customized printout, which says their name and some instructions on where to redeem their gift. So that's the layout that we have going on there. We can go ahead and then we can go back to the template. We can scroll up and we can hit print. Our dialog is going to appear. So we're going to look at it a little bit more as we start going through this, but here, if you note, we have the attendee number, which is unique to the attendee. We have the check-in status, so at a glance, we can quickly see has that person checked in or not, and then all the other information such as first name, last name, and the attendee type. So because we want to trigger that conditional form, we're going to select a random VIP guest here. So we'll hit next. We're going to see a preview, if you remember, of the badge itself. So, okay, let's double check that that's correct. The company name is correct. The attendee confirms. We're happy. And if this was not a VIP member, this would just print. But it is. So we're shown this form here. And the purpose of this form is just to give you an alert. So in the background, it's also going to print that secondary label, whatever that may be. And we'll see what that looks like. So we're happy. We know this is a VIP guest. Let's go ahead and hit print. And here's what's going to happen. So it's going to print a PDF. We have the form set up to cycle, so that's fine. We're going to bring up just, your regular Windows Explorer. So first we look at our event badge there. So we see it's customized. It has the barcode. That barcode contains unique information to identify this person. And then we also see the VIP voucher, because remember, this is a VIP member. And this is kind of what that letter and that voucher looks like. So with this, the guest can go and redeem the very special gift that we have available to them as a VIP member at our BarTender event. So once that's done and we give them instructions and all that, we can move on to the next person. So we've noticed that that list was pretty large. And we could make the text bigger, but that'll just kind of make it harder to scroll through. But we also want to be able to possibly search for it. And if you notice there, you see that that member is now checked in status. Yes, it's actually the second row there. So we also are passing some other information like the date and the time that they checked in, and we updated that database accordingly. So on the back end, that can be used for report building or whatever is that data or that information is needed for, or just for your records. But the next person is in line, and they give us their name. We don't see that on screen. We need a quick and easy way to select them. So as long as they've registered, we'll see them here in our database, and we'll be able to select the appropriate user. So this one, we only have one user that meets that criteria. So we'll go ahead and we'll say, okay, that looks correct, and then we can continue on. And that's going to be our scenario. So a little background information on how that works. You do have to have some data, obviously, and there is some background information as far as the requirements that the scenario might call for. But in this scenario, let's go ahead and go through some of the properties and how to access it, and then also just how things were set up in general. So this badge here we see is connected to our database. So this one is a Microsoft SQL Server database. We can explore the tables, we can get a view of the whole record set if needed, and review everything, make sure it's correct. Okay, so that looks good. We'll close out the database connection setup. And one thing to pay attention to is going to be, well, how do we access the actions, right? So as I mentioned earlier, so it's going to be File, and then BarTender Document Options. We're going to go to the Actions tab, and then we're going to click on the Document Actions icon. So here, the screen should look familiar to us, right? We see that we have our events on the left. This is how we got there. We have all the actions under the data entry completed, and we have some specific properties related to each of the actions that we have. So we've connected this into the database. We selected the right table. We see all that information, and I want to leave everything the same here. I don't want to update or mess with the attendee names or anything, but I do want to, and this is actually the screenshot that you saw earlier, but I do want to update the check-in status to yes. I do want to update the check-in time to the event time, so when this event occurred. And I also want to check in date. Maybe this was a weekend event, so what day over the weekend and what time did this particular person check in. And you can plug in and switch the names and switch the scenarios to meet your circumstances, but that's pretty much how this works. Now we probably want to know a little bit about, okay, how did we pass that data that's coming in from the database onto our secondary VIP voucher label? So under our print document action here, so we see a preview of what our file looks like. We see where that particular file is located, and as we click on the Name Data Sources tab, we'll be able to see we went ahead and this is where the variables are. So we have attendee number and VIP guest, and under the values, the variables are assigned. So you see here, we don't have to, or we're not restricted to just use a single variable, but instead we can use a combination of multiple variables, and we could even throw in some static data. So let's say that we want a dash in between the first and last name, or whatever data delimitation or formatting we need. Maybe it's a price and it's only coming in as a number. We can add currency icons or symbols and all that information. And essentially, that's how this particular demo was configured. The only thing the second one has, as I said, is that name data source. Otherwise, it's a pretty straightforward, pretty simple secondary label in this case. So we'll move on with some questions. Jasper?
First one we got here is what particular BarTender edition is required to use these actions?
For everything that we're covering today, you actually need to be on automation or higher.
How is licensing handled when using these actions if you're printing across multiple printers?
So you're still going to have to follow the standard BarTender licensing model, which is going to be that you're licensed by printer. So if you are doing any printing and it's not the same as the primary printer, you're just going to, that is just going to count as if you open that label yourself and print it to it, just like you would an integration or anything like that. If you're not printing, let's say you're just sending an email or something after the action is run, that's obviously not a print action. You're not printing, and it's not going to count against your printer count.
Can you share the variables in multiple BarTender documents?
As I mentioned earlier, when you open up that Insert Variables dialog, you really only have the variables that are available to you at that time, if you will. Sure, you could connect multiple documents to the same database or create the same name data sources and then share those. That would work, and that's actually something that I do. I export and import name data sources, but you're not going to be able to reference other name or other variables as such. You could always bring up a BarTender document like I did and reference a name data source or something to that degree in that document and then assign a variable to it, but you won't be able to call btw2.variable.
We have a person here that's currently on BarTender 2016. They're using our integration platform, and they kind of ask how this kind of plays in. Can they just keep their existing integration, or what's the difference between executing these actions inside the document?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if let's say you have a functioning 2016 integration and you come up to BarTender 2019, that is all still intact and it is backwards compatible. So you can definitely bring up your integration and that'll function. Now, the only thing to keep in mind is that the difference between these is that via an integration, it requires an event to occur that then triggers the actions. So usually that means integrating with the system or another business system of some sort. In this scenario, a print operator entering data, printing or canceling a print job, etc., that's what triggers it. So this is in addition to the existing integration platform and its flexibility, but not in place of. Because of time, I do want to continue on. So we can now move into the next part, which is going to be the form level actions. So this one is going to get a little bit more complicated, and at first it'll be a little harder to grasp, especially if you're a veteran BarTender user because you're so accustomed to a certain way something is done, right? But the form level actions kind of leverage a new functionality that BarTender has, and that is that you can have a form that doesn't necessarily print the template associated with it. So a little bit more explanation on that. So I can have a form with a blank template that's irrelevant, the size and all that is irrelevant, and that form, which is actually part of our demo today, and that form can select the label or the BarTender document, the layout, and then it can select a database record, or it can take data inputted by a user prompt, whatever that may be, wherever that data is coming from, and then apply that to whatever layout you selected. And then when you hit finish or print, it's going to execute whatever actions you have, sort of like your own little custom application front end, without needing to actually print anything for that document. So there's this concept where a form can print other labels or do other things or other actions, not even print anything, and that has nothing to do with the template associated with it. Of course, if you still want to use it how you've always used it, which is you design the template and you have user prompts that populate that template, etc., that still works. But this is just, once again, adding to the functionality, so you have the option of how you want to go about it. So the event under which these forms, and we'll see that the events are different, occur are going to be a little new or different than the document level actions. So when you click a button or you click a link, that specific link or button that you created will execute whatever actions you've programmed it to do. And I say programmed, what I really mean is the actions that you've created and configured under that button. You can also do things like when at the end of the form, once the form is completed, when the form closes. And to access these form level actions is a little different. So we want to go to our form. We want to click on Edit and then Properties. And we want to click on the form on the left side there. And then we're going to click on the Actions icon. So we're going to click on the Actions icon. That's going to open up that form for us. For the button or link, we just want to double click that particular object. And we'll also review that as well. So when we click on that, this is going to be the page that comes up. The main thing that I want to point out is the layout is more or less the same principle where the properties on the right depend on what action you have selected on the left, but the difference is going to be the events. So if those of you with good memory or better memory than I are going to notice that previously we had different actions such as on new record, every copy, print job end. Here we have form opened, validate data, form canceled, etc. So we have different event under which these actions are going to be executed. So what's the difference? What's the use case? Can we see this little form thing that I keep talking about in a demo? So let's go ahead and move into the demo section. So in this particular scenario, I have retired from my bartender event planning days, and I am now running my family-run bakery. I bake my own goods and I sell them to local stores. Now, depending on what is ordered, so is it a chocolate brownie, is it a vanilla cupcake, etc., I want to be able to select the correct layout. So that's going to be the size of the label, maybe the layout, in this case, both. And I need to pull data from the same database because there's some more important information that I need on that label. And I don't want to expose myself to that probability of user error. So what I want to do is I want a form that selects a document, lets me select the record, and then lets me populate the layout that I selected and print that out. So we're going to start with going through the different forms that we have. So remember that this particular form is not going to print anything template 1 related here, what you see in the bottom left hand corner of your screen. It's actually going to be calling other BTWs, other layouts. So this is going to be where I select individual, half dozen, or baker's dozen, which is going to be my layouts, the copies, and the record picker in the middle, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, is going to be the item that I actually want to pull data from. I only have the item name and the item number, but there's a lot more information associated with that record, and we're going to be using it. In my secondary form, I have a logo that we'll see in the top right hand corner, I believe, that we want to conditionally print. So yes or no on the logo, depending on the vendor, we might or might not need that. But I also run promotions sometimes to promote my bakery. So I want to be able to, at the top of the box or however I'm delivering this, throw in a few sheets of coupons for my stores that I'm selling to. So then they can either hand them out to the customer, display them with our products as is, etc. And we want to be able to select the coupon, coupon off percentage that we give them. And we don't always want to print that. We don't always want to give 20% off. So we want to give the option to select the percentage and then click that print promotional coupon sheet. And then that's going to print that. And then when I actually hit the print icon at the bottom right, that actually prints my label that I selected, my layout. So this is a quick preview. I'm just going to click through each one of those. We see that logo there on the top right, the different layouts. They look a little similarly shaped, but they're very different in dimensions and sizes. I should say sizes, yeah. And this is our coupon sheet, which is going to be like just some Avery stock or something like that, let's go ahead and say. So let's go ahead and close everything out. We really only need our selector BTW, that's just what I called it, our selector form open, because everything else is going to be dynamic and pulled in the background. So let's go ahead and hit print. We'll see the form come up for us. We're going to select our layout. So we have a baker's dozen ordered. We only need a single copy of this. So they were only ordered 1 dozen for some reason. Then we see here the record picker. So here I can either search at the top, which is what I have selected now or moused over, or I can use my mouse wheel to scroll through we call this the carousel, and select what I need. Now you have a lot of different options, and it comes down to what's best for your scenario and just kind of personal preference. You can have a list, you can have a drop down, you can have this carousel, you can have cards. So you have a lot of options available to you as far as what's easiest for your print operator, in this case my baker, to select. So my baker is going to go ahead and either search for what he needs to print, or he's going to type in and search for the correct item. So I'm browsing through my carousel here. I'm going to select the correct record that I want to print. So I'm going to go ahead and select puff pastries and hit next. I'm going to get the option for my conditional stuff, so my logo and such. Also, I'm going to select and go ahead and be generous and give them a 20% off coupon for this particular store. Clicking that icon there is actually going to print to my secondary printer. And then hitting that finish icon is going to actually print the actual baker's dozen label itself. Once again, I print it to PDF, so let's go ahead and pull up what those look like. When I'm actually printing and I go out to my bakery, I'm not going to be printing to PDF, I'm going to be using my physical printers, right? But this is an example of what it looks like. If we notice that we pulled in all the relevant information, the expiration date and all that is live and correct. And then we also have the coupon sheet. So this is what the coupon sheet that's printing on my LaserJet printer, on my Avery stock, whatever it may be, looks like. So I'm going to put this at the top of the box or whatever place or location is convenient, and then I'm going to deliver this separately. And that's kind of how you can leverage your form level actions to select a document, select a record, and then have that record set past that single record passed to the other document, which is whatever document you selected. So we'll want to see how that works, right? So we'll go ahead and we'll go through a little bit of an explanation as far as how everything is laid out. So here I only have the selector, BTW, and the one of the examples open. I actually have the form connected to a database. None of the documents that I print, like the baker's dozen and all that, are actually connected to the database. It's the form that's connected to the database. And remember, named data sources relate to variables. So I want to pay attention to my named data sources here. You see that some are static, embedded data in blue, and some are gray, which are named data sources associated with database fields. To access the actions here, I just double clicked on the anywhere blank form and then actions on the right. So here I happen to not have any actions because the actions that actually make up my little solution exist on my second form. So this is going to be where most of my logic exists, the background logic anyways. So I go to the same place and I open my actions. I click on that icon, and here we see I actually do have a print document action. I have a dynamic BarTender document selected. The printer is static, but I do have, because it's unchecked, I do have dynamic copies. And these named data sources exist on all my other BarTender documents. So those named data sources are critically important, and this is how I reference them using variables. So I'll close that out, and then that leaves us with that button, right? So we have that percent up there, we have the icon or the button, we go into the properties of it, and then in the actions, when we pull that up, we have a print document action. So every time I click on this icon, this document prints with the value of whatever percent off I set. That percent off coupon, if you notice, is a named data source on the left. And then other than that, that's the form configured. Remember, nothing prints on the template, so we don't have to worry about it for this example. Then we have one of the examples here, and we notice that we have all those named data sources. They're all embedded, they're all not connected to a database, and I just referenced those. And if I want to use it anywhere else or in any other location, I can click drag and drop and place it on my label, layout, however you want to reference that. And essentially what I did for this demo is I pretty much copied and pasted this, once I had this mapped and done, I copied and pasted 2 more times. I changed the layout to match my specs or the box dimensions or whatever it may be. I moved things around, I resized things, I used more variables or more named data sources, in some locations than others. And then based on that, other than the conditionally printing logo on the top right, is how I configured this demo. So you'll notice that you do have to do some foundational work to come up with this solution, but you give your print operator the simplicity of just doing everything in a single form and then continuing on to their main job, which in this case is baking some more goods for our family shop, right? And with that, we'll review some questions. Jasper, whenever you're ready, if you can jump on.
With all these BarTender documents and actions, if you were to execute them and print them through like one of our other companion applications like Print Portal or Print Station, does that all still work?
Like any solution, you want to test things because as you get more complex, things like permissions and relative directories and all that come into play. But the answer for that is yes. And personally, what I would do if I were to configure this for my bakery is I would have a process builder file on the desktop, and I would just double click on that process builder file. That'll bring up my form, which is where we just spent most of our time, and the print operator, my baker, can fill it out and print, and they never really open BarTender. What that does is it leverages, well, it gives you a little bit of simplicity, right? Even more simplicity. We don't really want them to see the designer. It might be intimidating. It's really just unnecessary for them to even know how things work, right? So we just want to keep it simple. We want to allow them to be as dynamic as possible with data, with layouts, etc. But we don't want to make that complicated. So the answer is yes, but as always, test.
Do you actually need data on the actual template, the BarTender document, to execute these actions on a form?
You don't need data on the template. You see that I had some text objects on there, a text object that says this template will not print. If you prefer to just leave it blank, that's completely fine. And I'm not sure if this is what you're inferring, but if it is, you're correct that you don't have to print anything. All these actions and all that, they can have absolutely nothing to do with printing. You can do something like browse to a CSV file, pull it in, convert it to a record set, and update my database. And you can build a form that does all that, and it has nothing to do with printing, but it gives you a little bit of automation and saves you a lot of time.
Can you execute these actions on other types of data entry controls besides like the forms and the button?
Okay, so for the document level action, they only exist under the events that we covered. So after print, after each record, that sort of scenario. In the form, it's a little bit different. You can have the form action, so upon completion, which is what we saw, or you can assign it to a button that you create. So every time you click a button, something happens. In our case, that coupon label printed out every time I click the button. Or you can also there's another control, which is a link. And every time you click that link, it can either take you to a website or execute whatever action you configured it to do.
Can you elaborate about changing the database in an action? Can you actually change any of the database configuration settings, any of these actions?
That is a good question, and the answer is it really depends on what we classify as a database. If we're talking about the settings in our database connection where we change from SQL Server 1 to SQL Server 2, off the top of my head, there's not really a way to do that. So the answer on that is no. But you have other options available to you. So let's say that this was like a CSV file or something like that that you were printing or you're pulling from. What you can do is you can source a list or a drop-down list to a folder and say, show me all the files in that folder. Then you have DB1, DB2 in that file. And as long, this is going to be the big thing, as long as the record set matches all your variables and mapping, you can change that on the fly. That goes into a little bit of a of a gray area where it is possible, but I wouldn't necessarily classify that as changing the settings in the database connection. So it's going to depend on the scenario, but something like that can be configured. The person that just asked that database question that I just answered, he mentioned that it's a CSV file. So yes, how I envision it, and I hope it's not too complicated or long of an explanation, but how I envision that is you put all your CSV files that have the same record set. The data can be different, but we want field 1, field 2, field 3 to be in the right order and all that, or to exist even. We map those to variables. Then we have dynamic templates that we can call, and then we have a drop-down list where they're able to select which CSV file they want to print that day or pull from that day, and which layout they want to print that day. And I can see something like that happening. I have not done that with our actions here. So depending on the details, the data and all that, there might be a better way to do that using the same actions. But just, off the top of my head here, thinking on my feet, that is possible and something could be built around that. It just kind of depends on the details. Okay, and that user, he says that does answer the question. So great. As always, I want to thank everyone for joining today. I want to once again close out with the statement that This is very specific examples for very specific scenarios, and every scenario is going to be different, and really the options are kind of endless. You can have as many actions as you need. You can have them do different things, and it's just your imagination, the scenario, and the combination of actions, and incorporate that all into your layouts. Once again, my name is Manny Castro of Siegel Scientific. My colleague's name is Jasper Wen, and on behalf of everyone here at Siegel, thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day.